Welcome to Wisdom Trek with Gramps. Wisdom is the final frontier for gaining true knowledge. Our mission is to create a legacy of wisdom, to seek out discernment and insights, to boldly grow where few have chosen to grow before. Hello, my friend. This is Gramps. Thanks for coming along on our journey to increase wisdom and create a living legacy. Today is day 1546 of our trek, and it is Worldview Wednesday. Creating a biblical worldview is essential to have a proper perspective on today's current events. To establish a biblical worldview, we must have a proper understanding of God and His Word. This week we will expand on our past coursework as we continue reviewing a book from Dr. Michael S. Heiser titled Supernatural. The book is an abbreviated version of his more comprehensive book, The Unseen Realm. I highly recommend both of these books. Creating a biblical worldview is based on how the Old and New Testament connect in God's overall plan for humanity is essential. This book review will help us to understand what the Bible teaches us about the unseen world and why it matters. Today we'll review a chapter called Rules of Engagement. So far we've covered the first 6 chapters of Supernatural. Here's what we've covered during the past 6 Worldview Wednesdays. God cast aside the nations and the people at Babel. The lesser gods assigned to them took dominion, and this can be found in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. When God started over with Abraham, it was clear that he planned to one day reclaim the nations through the influence of Israel. But the gods of the nations would have to be forced to surrender their power and worship. This meant conflict both in the seen and unseen realms. As soon as there was an Israel, she was in the crosshairs of these lesser gods. But let us focus on who is Yahweh. It doesn't take long in the biblical story for Israel to wind up in a precarious position. The story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 37 through 50 explains why Israel went to Egypt. God's providence turned the harm intended Joseph by his brothers to the salvation of Israel from famine. The fact that God didn't tell Israel to leave Egypt right away was also intentional. God knew that the Pharaoh who honored Joseph would die and be replaced by an enemy. He had foreseen that Egypt would put Israelite into forced labor. He also knew he would rescue Israel when the time was right. But why did he make the Israelites wait? God always has a good reason for suffering. We just can't always see it. In this case, though, Scripture makes it clear. After Moses had fled Egypt and taken residence in the wilderness, God called him at the burning bush, Exodus chapter 3, and then he sent him back to Egypt. His orders were simple. Tell Pharaoh, let my people go. Pharaoh had other ideas. In his mind and those of the Egyptians, he was God in flesh, the emblem of all its glory and power. He wasn't going to let some invisible God of the Hebrew shepherd tell him what to do. He didn't even know whether the God of Moses was real. He mockingly replied in Exodus chapter 5 verse 2, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go?" He was about to get his answer, one that would really hurt. God had set him up. God had told Moses, "I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go." Exodus chapter 4 verse 21. God had a fight to pick. After they had oppressed the Israelites for centuries, it was time for Egypt and its God to be punished. Pharaoh's hardening was part of that plot. The Bible tells us that the plagues were aimed at Egypt's gods, especially the last one, the death of the firstborn. This final plague turned out to be a direct assault on Pharaoh's house. Here's the description. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the captives who were in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Pharaoh had mocked God, and the tables had been drastically turned. As Paul would later put it in Galatians chapter 6 verse 7, "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap." The pounding Egypt took on the way to the Israelites' release from Egypt had the desired effect. People as far away as Canaan heard about the thrashing Israel's God had given to Egypt and its gods. This is when those nations recalled the exodus of the Israelites. Jethro, Moses' Midian father-in-law, summed up the lesson when Moses finally returned in Exodus chapter 18 verse 11. "Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the gods." It's no wonder that Moses, on the other side of the Red Sea, asked this rhetorical question, mocking Pharaoh and his lost army. In Exodus chapter 15 verse 11, who is like the Lord among the gods. Once out of Egypt through the Red Sea, the Israelites knew where they were headed. They were going to meet their God at his latest earthly home and headquarters, Mount Sinai. In truth, the Israelites didn't know much about God. There was no Bible at all in the days of the Exodus. The only knowledge that the Israelites had about God, they had gained through the stories that they heard from their parents passed down from generation to generation. Reading the story now in the Bible, we can clearly see what God was up to. The Israelites had a lot to learn, and Sinai was the classroom. We see here that Israel was God's family and his earthly representatives. When Moses had stood before Pharaoh before the Exodus, he told God he had a message. Israel is my son, my firstborn. Release my son and let him serve me. That idea of God having a son, in this case, referring to all of Abraham's descendants, is essential. It takes us back to God's creation of Adam and Eve. God wanted a human family. He wanted to live on his creation earth with the people that he had made. God wanted his unseen family and his human family to live with him and serve him. He wanted people to multiply and for all the earth to become like Eden. But when God forsook humanity at the Tower of Babel, he had no children, until he called Abraham. Israel was God's new family. It was time to get back to the original plan. As Adam and Eve had been God's earthly messengers, Israel would now fill that role. Going back to Sinai was a homecoming. Even the heavenly council was there, watching as God's plan was put back into motion. They were witnesses to a new covenant between God and his people, which was the law. But what most people don't understand is the law of God was delivered by God's counsel. Did it surprise you when I said that the heavenly council was present at Sinai when God delivered the Ten Commandments? If you have ever seen the movie about the Exodus and the trip to Sinai, you didn't see any angels in it. But the Bible said that they were there. It even says that they delivered God's law, and this can be found in Acts chapter 7, verse 52 and verse 53, and Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. It also said that the law was written with the finger of God, Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. That language should be familiar, God in human form. God was on Sinai, appearing as a man, just like the story in Genesis about the angel of the Lord. He and his heavenly host gave the law to Moses and to Israel. After giving of the law, Moses, Aaron, and Aaron's sons, and 70 of the Israel elders got to see the God of Israel in human form again. This time they met for a meal, and this can be found in Exodus chapter 24, verses 9 through 11. Just as the Last Supper in Jesus' time sealed the new covenant of his blood, this meal celebrated God's new covenant with Israel on Sinai, which was the law. God gave Israel the law so that they would be holy. He wanted Israel to be set apart from the other people, distinguishable to everyone as his own family. As God is entirely distinct from all the lesser gods and everything earthly, God's people needed to be distinct. What did holiness mean? What was the concept behind it? Holiness did not mean being odd. Holiness is to be identified with the Lord, dedicated to God, and enjoyed all the good things in life that come from being right with God. God wanted Israel to attract the other nations to come back to him. That is why the Bible calls Israel a kingdom of priests and a light for the nations. The entire nation inherited God's position to be a blessing to all nations. And this requires believing loyalty. Being right with God is another way of talking about salvation. But despite what you've been taught in Sunday school, salvation didn't come to the Israelites by obeying the rules, that is, by following the law. Whether in the Old Testament or in the New, salvation is never earned or even deserved. It is given by the grace of God in response to faith. The Israelites and those of us born after Christ's death and resurrection had to have faith. They had to believe their God was the God of all gods, trusting that he made them his people. They alone had access to the God of gods. The law was not how Israelites achieved salvation. It was how they showed loyalty to God that they believed in. Salvation for an Israelite was about faith in the promises and character of the God of gods and about refusing to worship another God. It was about belief and loyalty from the heart, not earning brownie points with God. Here's an example. King David did awful things like commit adultery and arrange a murder. 2 Samuel chapter 11. According to the law, he was a lawbreaker and deserved to die for his crime. Even so, David never wavered in his belief in Yahweh as the Most High God. He never switched his loyalty to another god, and God was merciful to him. The same is true in the New Testament. Believing the gospel means believing the God of Israel came to earth as a man, voluntarily died on the cross as a sacrifice for our sin, and rose again on the third day. We must embrace that by faith and then show our loyalty to Jesus by forsaking all other gods. Regardless of what those other gods may say about salvation, the Bible tells us there is no salvation in any other name than Jesus, Acts 4:12, and that this faith must remain intact, Romans chapter 11 verses 17 through 24, and Hebrews chapter 3. Personal failure is not the same as trading Jesus for other gods, and God can tell the difference. And you might once again ask, why does this matter? There's a lot of fascinating symbolism in the Exodus and what happened at Sinai. The scene where Moses and the others have a meal with God in human form on Sinai catches our attention right away. There are 70 elders with Moses. If you count the nations in Genesis chapter 10 that God cast aside at the Tower of Babel incident, you also get 70. Those nations were assigned to the sons of God, the other lesser gods, when the God of Israel judged the nations. Why 70 elders, 70 sons of God, and 70 disinherited nations? The correspondence was deliberate. When Jesus started his earthly ministry, he sent out 70 disciples, Luke chapter 10, verse 1. This act was a precursor to the Great Commission. The number telegraphed the idea that the disciples of Jesus would reclaim the nations for God's kingdom rule. That kingdom would reach its final form in the end days in the new global Eden of Revelation chapter 21 and 22. The repetition of the number 70 is a message. God's new earthly family Israel, the children of Abraham, would be the means to recover what was lost. The story doesn't stop there. The Apostle Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 3 that believers have inherited the promises of Abraham. Everyone who believes in Jesus is a child of Abraham through faith. That means you and I are tasked with taking back the nations from these lesser gods. It is our task to turn people under the spiritual dominion of other gods to faith in Jesus. We are God's new human council on earth, and when we are glorified, we will join his divine family in the new Eden. The Bible conveys these ideas in many places. The book of Revelation describes the believer inheriting the rule of the nations with Jesus at the end of the days, Revelation chapter 3 verse 21. That means we will displace the sons of God who have dominated those nations since Babel. This is why John says believers have the authority to be children of God, John chapter 1 verse 12, compared to 1 John chapter 3 verses 1 through 3. And we will, in fact, displace the divine but hostile sons of God in the last days. This is also why Paul, when writing to the believers to stop letting the world's courts resolve their disputes, says, "Do you not know that we will judge angels?" 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 3. When we are made divine or glorified on the new earth, we will outrank these angels. One day, we will be made like Jesus. 1 John chapter 3 verses 1 through 3 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 35 through 49. And we will rule with him over the nations, Revelation chapter 2 verse 26. These nations are currently controlled by hostile gods. Believers, the spiritual offspring of Abraham, will ultimately reverse the disinheritance of the nations along with the curse of death that extended from Eden's failure. We ought to live as if we believe in this destiny. Everything in the Old Testament plan leads to us. Think back to Eden. God wanted his two families, one divine, the other human, to live and rule together in Eden. But we saw that that plan was ruined by rebellion, but revived by the rescue of Israel from Egypt. Out of Abraham's children would come the Messiah, who would undo the failure in Eden. Without an Israel, we would have no destiny. And that's precisely why the gods and their followers would try again to erase Israel. That will finish our study for this week's Worldview Wednesday. Join us again next week as we continue to build our biblical worldview. Tomorrow we will ponder another bit of wisdom from Gramps. So encourage your friends and family to join us and then come along with us tomorrow for another day of Wisdom Trek, Creating a Legacy. If you'd like to listen to any of the past 1,545 treks or read the Wisdom Journals, they are all available at wisdom-trek.com. And I encourage you to subscribe to Wisdom Trek on your favorite podcast player so that each day's trek will be downloaded to you automatically. And thank you so much for allowing me to be your guide, your mentor, but most importantly, I am your friend as I serve you through the Wisdom Trek podcast and journal each day. And as we take this trek of life together, let us always live abundantly, love unconditionally, listen intentionally, learn continuously, lend to others generously, lead with integrity, and leave a living legacy each day. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, reminding you to keep moving forward, enjoy your journey, and create a great day every day. See you tomorrow.